If somehow you are an entity that makes money and helps put these products into commerce, you need to be familiar with what the FDA regulates, how they regulate it, and the trends of what they're looking at.
Hello, welcome to a very special episode of FDA Watch. I'm your host, Wayne Pines. As you know, we're the leading independent podcast on FDA, and we continue to grow episode by episode. Very pleased with the listenership that we've had. I'm very excited about this episode. It's the first installment in one of our signature multi-episode series that we produce in collaboration with law firms and other organizations. Today's episode is the first we're doing jointly with one of the best-known food and drug law firms, Arnold, Golden, Gregory. The four-part series will focus on several issues. Today we're going to be discussing the current state of enforcement by FDA and the Department of Justice, DOJ. Unfortunately, we have just the right person to lead us on that journey, Gabe Scanapieko. Gabe is a partner at Arnold, Golden, Gregory, co-chair of the firm's life sciences industry team. He focuses on litigation, compliance, investigations. He's a former assistant director in the DOJ Consumer Protection Branch. He advises clients on enforcement risks, internal investigations, and other disputes involving FDA-regulated products. So, Gabe, it's good to see you and to meet you.
Thanks for having me in.
So let's begin with an overview question. What's the big picture? What are the headline stories in 2026 in terms of trends in DOJ enforcement involving FDA products?
Sure. I think that, the headline relating to FDA and DOJ is that, we see them applying what we would call traditional enforcement theories, things like misbranding, adulteration, information about unapproved new drugs, manufacturing violations, to an unprecedented range of actors in the FDA regulated space. We see enforcement against telehealth platforms marketing compounded drugs, against outsourcing facilities that compound at scale with what's becoming a less and less adequate legal basis. We're seeing direct-to-consumer digital health companies making claims about unapproved products and getting letters. We see enforcement against online marketplaces that have facilitated the sales of FDA-regulated products and controlled substance precursors, getting DOJ focus. And so basically, I think the headline is that more so today than any time before, that anyone who touches an FDA regulated product is no longer outside the enforcement perimeter.
So the obvious question is why? Why is that happening?
I think the answer is that the FDA and the DOJ, as they have been before, and increasingly over time, they're focused on product integrity. And so, we see that across a number of spaces. We see that related to GLP-1s and other compounded products. We see that related to how they are looking at online platforms and the types of products that are being sold there that might be FDA regulated. And we're seeing that in other areas of how they're looking at large manufacturers or other entities, the way that they're dealing with pharmacovigilance, how they are looking at clinical trial transparency. Sort of in all these factors, I think it always just comes down to product integrity, product safety.
Is there any reason why here in 2026 there should be unprecedented focus on FDA, or is it just the natural evolution of DOJ?
I think part of it is a natural evolution, but we also have certain things that are driving these enforcement actions that we've seen based off of market factors that maybe we haven't seen before, like in the GLP space, right? That's a space that exploded, right, over the last 5 years. And as the shortages have gone away, we have this, sort of large sort of economic engine behind this. and FDA now trying to reassert itself. So, in addition to sort of its traditional focus, there are market factors at play that relate in that particular space. Sort of the same thing that we see on these online platform enforcement actions. More and more products are being sold online, right? And those are being facilitated by entities like Alibaba, who was the subject of a criminal resolution at the beginning of this month. So as more people turn to the internet to get their prescriptions, to get their products, to get healthcare, uh, as that increases, I think we're going to see more and more enforcement in reaction to that space.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about some of these products. GLP-1s, obviously they're front page news very frequently, new data, new uses, reimbursement issues. Where is DOJ on that issue, especially relating to compounding?
Well, I think, it's a combination between FDA and DOJ, right? We've really seen the FDA out in front of this issue over the last 12 months or so. And, it's sort of a little bit TBD where DOJ is going to step in, depending on how, some of these, um, bulk compounders and other entities react to sort of the wave of warning letters and other actions that we've seen over the last 12 months. So there's a bit of a story there that's kind of interesting to see how that develops.
Yeah, where are we? Are there still um, there's still compounding going on?
Yes.
I think we see ads for compounders. FDA and DOJ have expressed concern about that. Where is that headed?
So I think, right, we saw the drugs come off of the shortage lists a little over a year ago. And in the last 12, more than 12 months, but 12 to 18 months, we've seen a wave of warning letters come out from FDA, right? And starting in September 2025, FDA issued over 100 warning letters and untitled letters to companies that compounded and marketed GLP-1s. And there they were focusing on the false and misleading claims about the safety, efficacy, approval status, and labeling of these products. And following that, we saw several other waves, right? We saw one hit in February 2026, focused primarily on direct-to-consumer telehealth and compounding platforms that had built substantial businesses, right? If you go online and you just type in, hey, looking for weight loss drugs, a ton of these sites are going to pop up. And so that it became a multi-billion dollar industry. And so we started seeing warning letters go there. And then in March, we saw more going to telehealth companies. And in June, even just a month ago, we saw them issuing another 25 warning letters to, again, these telehealth and weight loss companies. So I think that across all of them, what's really interesting is that these letters target the compounders, the providers, the advertisers, and the telehealth platforms themselves. And so you see FDA applying this pressure at all sort of levels of the distribution chain. And it's going to be interesting to see how each one of those responds and then how FDA collaborates with DOJ to focus civil or maybe even criminal enforcement actions against those actors that, just are, continue to potentially flaunt FDA regulations in their promotion of GLP-1s.
Right. So they are flaunting them. I'm glad you characterized it that way.
I mean, some are, yeah. I think it's really interesting the way that a lot of these letters and the theories have been framed by FDA. Across all these different waves, we've seen something about like the net impression of what the different sites are providing about GLP-1s. And so even if there are some sort of individual statements on the pages that may be true, I think what's happening is that on a lot of these, a lot of what you see nowadays is that there are, statements of it might be FDA approved, or it states that maybe it is Ozempic, or it sounds like it's Ozempic or another branded product when these compounded products that are being sold or not. And so there's been a greater focus on sort of the overall nature that it tends to mislead some consumers as to specifically what they might be buying. And that's just in sort of the advertising. I think there are also some known issues about certain sources of API that there have been scrutiny as to whether or not those are safe.
What are the general takeaways for other compounders or for other telehealth companies from what's going on with the GLP-1s?
Well, I think there's a couple. So the first goes to, I think, the way that they market the materials and that the way that they describe compounded drugs versus, what might be an authorized generic of a drug or a brand name of a drug, right? They're not the same things. They may have different strengths. They are, manufactured in different ways, and so the more that people conflate, compounded drugs to a generic form of a drug, I think that's going to encounter more resistance from the FDA. And the other thing that I haven't mentioned yet, and I think that is really, really important, is that the FDA. We're just talking about warning letters so far, but FDA has also is addressing this now in its proposed rules about the bulk listing, right? In April, I think it was in April, yeah, just a couple months ago, FDA issued a proposed rule to exclude, right, semaglutide, tirzepatide, and other GLP-1s from the 503B bulks list. If finalized, right, outsourcing facilities, these big 503B facilities that have been compounding without, sort of individual patient specific prescriptions, they're going to lose the basis to compound, some of these very high value drugs. And so, not just in the GLP-1 space, but in the other spaces where there may be scrutiny on compounded drugs, I think that these companies need to be aware that FDA may take more sweeping action to just prevent their ability to compound this at all through what they do allow to have on and what they don't allow to have on the bulks list.
Do you see any implications for other telehealth companies? I mean, we all know what telehealth is. In this case, with these GLP-1s, doctors are prescribing via telehealth to patients that
Hmm.
they really don't know, but that's where the prescriptions are coming from. What are the takeaways for companies that are really engaged in telehealth, where they engage with patients, with consumers? I'm going to say more legitimately, so to speak.
Sure. Well, I mean, more legitimately, I think that there is some capability if you have a telehealth platform and you're dealing with patients and they need access through that, and that you're making decisions, sort of like sound medical decisions as to what they need. Perhaps they need a slightly modified version of a drug that needs to be compounded, and they can provide that. That's great. But I think that, there does need to be some type of oversight of the individuals that are writing the prescriptions and what they're looking at when they're making those decisions. And not just in GLP-1s, but I think across a sort of a number of products.
Interesting stuff going on with those GLP-1s across the board.
Yeah,
Uh,
indeed.
I want to shift gears. You mentioned Alibaba before,
Hmm.
and there was an important agreement involving DOJ where they announced its non-prosecution agreement resolution with Alibaba and with AUS Merchant Services. Can you summarize what those cases were about and, generally speaking, why they're important to the FDA community?
Sure. So, like you said, at the beginning of this month, Alibaba Group and its payment processor, AUS Merchant Services, entered into a non prosecution agreement and agreed to pay $600 million to resolve DOJ allegations that they violated the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and other federal laws by failing to prevent sales and imports through their platforms of uh, uh, you know non-conforming products, counterfeit products. And so what they admitted to basically, in fact, was that for about 8 years, almost from January 2016 through the end of 2024, they stated that they completed approximately 80,000 U.S. bound transactions involving illegal pharmaceuticals, controlled or regulated chemicals, and equipment that can be used to counterfeit medications. And so I think there's a few takeaways from that that really stand out to me. Number one, this is an expansion of a theory by DOJ to cover the transactions of illicit pharmaceuticals and other medical devices or precursor chemicals or manufacturing devices that we've seen for the last 2 years. I don't know if you recall this, but at the beginning of 2024, the Consumer Protection Branch and some other DOJ components entered into a civil resolution with eBay related to the sale of pill presses and punches and dyes on their platform. And that was under the Controlled Substances Act. And so, that's a smaller set of potential products that can be covered. And so it may not apply to as many types of platforms. And so this really looks like an expansion of that to now cover FDCA liability, right? Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act liability, which in parts of it has strict, criminal liability for misdemeanors. So it's quite a step forward in the pressure in enforcement against these platforms.
So I work for a pharmaceutical company. What does it mean to me?
If you're a pharmaceutical company, what does it mean to you? I mean, hopefully, to the extent that you're dealing with a platform, and if you are it, less so into counterfeit medications themselves or something like that, but to the extent that you sell materials that can help create you know counterfeit products, if you make precursor chemicals, if you are somehow that's being supplied through these platforms, if somehow the machinery is being supplied through these platforms, I think it's going to become harder and harder to say that, hey, we just are sending this out there, it's facilitated through the platform, and we make the sale. So I think it sort of relates to, there's going to be some dangers to the manufacturers as to whether or not they're doing their due diligence about the platforms. But I do think that sort of the greater risk is to these platforms themselves that are becoming a greater and greater having a greater and greater role in the distribution of a lot of FDA regulated products, right? The Alibaba case talked about 80,000 transactions, right? This isn't small. These platforms have tens of thousands. They actually have millions of transactions related to FDA regulated products. And so, I mean, eBay and now this are incredibly strong wake-up calls for any platform that facilitates the sale of FDA regulated product.
So the lesson for the pharmaceutical industry and for other related industries is be aware of these cases and be on extra alert in terms of your interactions with other companies. Is that fair?
I think that's right. And for some of these entities that have less familiarity with the FDA, right? Like if you're a big manufacturer, you have a huge compliance department, you're dealing with the FDA all the time. If you are a distributor, or if you're sort of a telehealth site that's rising up, right? It just shows that enforcement is moving away from where a lot of people without familiarity with the FDA think its focus has always been, right? The lens has broadened. It is looking at the entire landscape. DOJ is there looking at the entire landscape. And so, if somehow you are an entity that makes money and helps put these products into commerce, you need to be familiar with what the FDA regulates, how they regulate it, and the trends of what they're looking at.
All right. On that note, we're going to take a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. And we're back. We're talking with Gabe Scanapieco, partner at Arnold Golden Gregory. He's co-chair of the firm's life sciences industry team. I want to shift gears and talk about other products under scrutiny. We've talked about GLP-1s. We've talked about telehealth in general. What other kinds of FDA-regulated products are drawing attention from either FDA or DOJ?
Well, so I think there are a few. A lot of them are sort of on the vanguard of development. The first, that worth mentioning because there's both DOJ and FDA focus is, I think, skin substitutes and allografts. We've seen those be included in the recent DOJ healthcare fraud takedown. And so that, related primarily to billing practices, which, may not be the focus of this podcast. But I think it's also, there's an important FDA product safety dimension that goes beyond that sort of billing fraud headline that we see every summer with these takedowns. These are biological products that are derived from human tissue, and their regulatory classification remains a live regulatory question. So many of the products at the center of the fraud takedown are products that companies acquire from tissue banks. They relabel them under their own brand and they sell them at markups. And so, from an FDA product safety standpoint, the concern is whether relabeling, repackaging, and mass marketing these products, which made a lot of money without sufficient quality controls, might constitute misbranding, or it might introduce products that just don't meet the applicable regulatory requirements for their classification. So, I do think that that's one area that we've seen recent action that sort of demonstrates this continued focus by FDA with product efficacy, particularly in emerging fields.
Any other products you'd mentioned that have been focused on recently, either by FDA or DOJ, that are worth mentioning?
Sure, and I think I talked about a little about it up at top, but I think peptides are the next GLP-1s, right? Anything that you can people can take and put in their bodies and kind of make them, supposedly feel fantastic, no matter whether they are very well established, and there's a lot of scientific support for that, and in some cases where there's less, is going to be, for better or for worse, a larger and larger part of the American economy. And I think that peptides are starting to fill that role. And so FDA has been focused on those in the last couple years. They've placed numerous peptide bulk drug substances in category 2. And that's category you can put them in if they're known to have safety risks, quality concerns, insufficient public, safety data, that sort of thing. And they've continued to look at these, right? We've had some, changes in 2026. A couple months ago, FDA moved some of the substances out of Category 2 and began considering whether they should be included in the bulks list. But that consideration, that's not FDA approval on its own, and they're not on the list yet. And a lot of the people, in the Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee for FDA itself, have, I think that there's some pushback within FDA to have a lot of these substances added to the list. So I think this is another area where we're just going to see increasing focus because it's just sort of like the hot thing out there. If you get on Instagram, like if I get on my kids' Instagram, which I don't do because I'm too old, I'm not that interested in Instagram, but you have influencers talking about this. I've seen people on my own LinkedIn have videos about peptides. So I really think that that's another area where we're going to see a lot of focus in the future.
Yeah, I don't think we've heard the end of peptides. I think we'll be dealing with it in the future on this podcast. I want to turn now to the more traditional enforcement tools that FDA uses, like warning letters, pharmacovigilance failures, promotional use. What are the headlines that you see in that area with regard to DOJ and some of the prosecutions that have been contemplated or that might go on?
I don't know if this is a contemplated prosecution, but the biggest headline to me, at least in pharmacovigilance, was there was a warning letter issued to Novo Nordisk in March, which I think is just one of the more consequential letters of the year. In that letter, FDA describes systemic failures on how this large manufacturer received, validated, reviewed, and followed up on adverse events. um, and so I think that in that space, that's the sort of the biggest event in the last few months. Um, there were a lot of issues there, uh, not related necessarily to the procedures, um, only, but to also sort of how those were used in practice, right? So, in terms of the procedures, they allowed adverse event reports to be rejected or canceled if the person reporting the event believed that it was unrelated to the drug. Um, that's not how the law works, right? Adverse events come in, they say, "Hey, I took this drug, I had this adverse event." And then it's up to regulators to figure out whether or not that there's a causal, connection there or not the person receiving it at the manufacturer. So I think that, this was a good instance in a letter identifying where in a policy that there were mistakes. But also, I think the importance was, and that people should always keep in mind, it's not just what you have down in your policies, but it's how these things are put into practice. And another big issue that they had in this particular case was that the company, and it had a call center contractors that they were using, were improperly invalidating cases for what they had quote unquote missing patient identifiers, like if they didn't get a full name, they wouldn't, sort of note the information because they said, oh, it's incomplete, so we can't use it. And again, the practical effect of that was that it reduced the number of adverse events. And so it kind of skewed the view of, what was going on with Novo's products.
So lessons for all pharmaceutical companies with regard to how they handle complaints, how they handle other information, pharmacovigilance. Is that the takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, the takeaway is what everything old is new again, but you need to focus not just on having policies that can sufficiently address pharmacovigilance issues for your products, but you need to make sure that those are being implemented to the properly, and there need to be checks in place where people are reviewing the policies and the people who are implementing them to make sure that is actually happening. Because if it's not, and FDA catches wind of that, that's going to turn into warning letters and failure to act on something that important. In my experience when I was at DOJ, can quickly turn into a consent decree negotiation that you're having with DOJ, which no one wants to have because they typically result in a shutdown pending the resolution of all the issues that are raised underlying the consent decree. And they can even, result in, a criminal investigation if the number of adverse events that are being reported are lowered so much that it begins to pose a safety risk to, sort of a substantial safety risk to, the patient population.
So that leads me to my final question, which I think you've already begun to address. I always like to provide some practical guidance for our listeners. Given everything we've talked about with FDA, with DOJ enforcement, what do companies do now? What should they watch for in the second half of the year and beyond with regard to DOJ's interest in FDA regulated products?
Again, like I said before, the common thread across, I think, all this enforcement action we're seeing, either through FDA actions or DOJ actions, is maintaining product integrity, right? FDA is there to ensure that drugs, biologics, and devices reaching patients are safe and effective and accurately represented, right? So when we see actions about sort of advertising of drugs and those sorts of things, that's key. And so every enforcement action I think that I've talked about today, GLP-1s, platforms, pharmacovigilance, all of that, it's all about whether the systems surrounding these products are functioning. So if I'm at one of these companies, what do I want to do? First, if I'm at a company involved in compounding products, I think that, you know, I would immediately look at looking at our legal and promotional review, right? We want to make sure that if they are advertising or there are platforms that we are distinguishing compounded drugs from approved drugs clearly, right? We want to make sure that we remove any sort of statements towards that it's a generic, it's FDA approved, and any unsupported equivalence implications. Uh, and then, we want to confirm that if we are working with a compounder, that the compounder itself is legitimate. And when we do have a product, that the compounder is accurately identified. And at the end of the day, from a business standpoint, I think that there needs to be a consideration that if the product is either put on or taken off of a bulks list, what effect will that have on the overall business? Because that could happen quickly and it could really implicate business. Um, in terms of these other companies that I was talking about that are not always in the traditional space, the sales platforms that people are using, the Amazons of the world, the like the Alibabas, the eBays of the world. um, I think the answer there is that they need to test whether their compliance systems are mitigating prohibited transactions. These are very, very advanced companies that use advanced analytics, AI, are able to push out messages that are very specific to the individual user. And if they're able to do that on the sales end of things, they need to be taking as much care and using similar technologies to look for trends on their platforms showing the misuse or the of the platform to lead to illegal sales. um, and then finally I think that if you're one of these a traditional company out there, given what we've seen in recent warning letters related to pharmacovigilance or CGMP, you just always have to have a strong compliance system and you need to make sure you audit it. That hasn't changed. That's been the same over years and years and years. And it continues to be the case. And I think now more than ever, again, because of the ability for people to quickly run through information using AI, they're much more automated processes, that FDA and DOJ are both expecting companies to proactively be using systems like that to identify any shortcomings in their procedures or the way that they're applied. So I think those are the kind of the big takeaways of what we've seen at the beginning of 2026. And I can kind of put my Kresgen hat on now and tell you what I think might happen in the next 6 months if you want. I'd look for, I think a few developments, right? Number one, that is just going to have the biggest industry impact is whatever the final rule is going to be on GLP-1 bulks. I think that, this is an area where so far the trend has been to try to counteract this sort of massive growth in the bulk compounding of these products. And so, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a decision that that sort of reaffirms the proposed rule to take them off the bulks list, and then we start seeing just a ton of administrative and judicial challenges of those decisions. So I guess Loper Bright is going to be a word that you're going to hear a lot in the second half of 2026 if you're into the GLP-1 space.
Before you continue, I thought
Sure.
local bright would be a much more prominent feature for the last year and a half, and you're the first person in a while on our podcast to mention it in a sentence. Relate what it is, just to remind our audience, and then let me urge you to continue with your list of advice to companies.
Sure. So for administrative rulemaking, there's this whole process that that agencies have to go through to pass an administrative rule. So you have a proposed rule, then you have notice and comment, and then you get to a final rule. And part of that is that the agency has to review all the information that's available, the scientific information, the comments that come in, and attempt to make a reasoned decision that supports whatever position they take. I.e., like if they say, hey, these products should no longer be on the bulks list, they need to provide a justification for that. Um, Up until a couple of years ago, agencies were given what was called Chevron deference. Basically, if agency had a reason, to be able to pass it, there was a high level of deference that the courts would provide to them. That was rolled back a couple of years ago in a case named Loper Bright and some of its progeny. And so there now is a higher burden on administrative agencies when they pass rules, that the record behind that passage needs to really support the results that come out. And so if you have an instance like this that's hotly contested, where some people may say it's not good to have all these products on the bulks list and allow them to be compounded because of reasons A, B, and C. There's a lot of other thought on the other side saying, here are all these reasons why we might want to have GLP-1s compounded, and the decision to take those off of the list may lead to, society-wide health effects and those sorts of things. And so it allows people to challenge the underlying justifications for a rule more easily whenever dealing with a administrative rule. Now, this is coming from someone who's not an administrative law specialist. We have other people at our firm that do that, but it used to be a lot easier to defend agency rules prior to that Supreme Court ruling.
Right, I think that's the bottom line. But let me ask you to continue with your list of the practical advice to companies. A very useful.
Sure. I think we're going to see a similar thing in the peptide space, right? I told you that, earlier there was going to be this meeting at the end of July where the advisory committee is meeting on peptide-related bulk substances. And, depending on whatever FDA's decision is, this could, kind of substantially impact the current way that peptides are being marketed and sold versus now versus what might come out if these items are not put on the bulks list. Third, I think that you will continue to see, just A, because it's lucrative, B, because sort of the overall scope of how it can get products out there, is that eBay and Alibaba are not going to be the end of story for platform liability. I think that that is a theory that is becoming more and more mature in DOJ. And now the application of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and not just the Controlled Substances Act, means that it's just going to cover a lot more products. And it's going to make it easier to threaten criminal action because the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, unlike the CSA, has strict liability, misdemeanor liability. And so that's just a much bigger stick in the DOJ's arsenal than we've seen before. I don't know if these cases will be in the next 6 months, but this is a broad theory, and I think that we are going to see this applied against other platforms in the future. Finally, I think that given the number of warning letter initiatives that we've seen in the last few years and in the last few months specifically, that we're going to see a increased wave of either FDA action like import detentions. I'd see product seizures. We might see DOJ bringing injunctions, civil monetary penalties that are following up on these campaigns that have been raised in the last few months. And so I think that you're going to see a lot of these things kind of reach out their lifetime in the enforcement space. So those are my four general things to look for in the next 6 months or so.
Great. Gabe, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
You really have provided some good guidance for companies and really appreciate it. So it's a great start to our 4-part series that we're doing in collaboration with your law firm, Arnold Golden Gregory. I also want to thank our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Levin Epstein, our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. I want to remind our listeners, if you want to find out more about these podcasts, just visit our website, fdawatch.net. That's fdawatch.net. And if you don't want to miss parts 2, 3, and 4 of this series or any episode of FDA Watch, you can subscribe to the podcast. It's free. It's available on all your favorite podcast platforms, but you have to subscribe by going to fdawatch.net. And all you've got to do is put in your email address and say subscribe. As we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch. This is Wayne Pines.